Great, we're going to get started in just about 30 more seconds. Thank you for coming in. Okay, I am here to welcome you to a discussion of New York City schools and spending presented by the New York City Independent Budget Office and Chalkbeat, New York. We are going to get started. So I'm going to start off with the agenda. My name is Julia Conrad. I am the Assistant Director for the Education team at the New York City Independent Budget Office. We are an independent government agency, and our mission is to provide information to the public on New York City's budget and policies. We are here tonight in conversation with the amazing team from Chalkbeat, New York, and we are here to talk about and have a discussion on New York City schools and spending. It's a really pivotal point in New York City right now as we transition from one mayoral administration to another. And so we're here tonight to share some of IBO's findings, driven by the data-driven research that we do in conversation with Chalkbeat and the reporting that they do of on-the-ground, real-time what's happening for New York City students and families. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an agenda walkthrough and then share some housekeeping before I kick it over to the team. We are going to talk through two different IBO publications, which we'll share in the chat as well. We'll start with our education indicators, which is an annual report we do on a lot of different New York City schools, students, and teachers. Tonight, we'll focus on enrollment, attendance, and achievement trends, as well as our spotlight on students in temporary housing. After Emma, and I'll introduce Emma in just a second, shares about that report, the team from Chalkbeat is going to lead a moderated discussion between our team at IBO and Chalkbeat. And then we'll follow up with another conversation. So our team will present a report called Education Spending Since 1990, which focuses on DOE spending patterns and fiscal pressures. And then we'll have another moderated discussion. A little bit of housekeeping that we want to make sure we share up at the front. So we are going to have opportunities for audience questions, but we are asking that you put those in the chat. And we are asking that you are welcome to type your questions into the chat tonight at any point. We are going to be keeping an eye on the chat and pulling those together and handing them over to Mike, who's going to be leading our discussion. So we ask that you stay on mute because we'll be a pretty big group tonight, but we do encourage questions. We really are eager for them. So feel free to use the chat in Zoom and you can type in your question there. If we don't answer it right away, we are hopeful that we're saving some time at the end of tonight to have more of that audience Q&A brought in, but we're also going to see if we can weave in some of these questions throughout our discussion tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce who you'll be hearing from. So first, I have the pleasure of introducing Emma Gossett. She is a lead budget and policy analyst on IBO's education team. She especially focuses on early childhood education, so she's one of our experts tonight. Michael Elson-Rooney joins us. He's an education reporter at Chalkbeat. He'll be leading the discussion and bringing in those insights that are informed by Chalkbeat's reporting in New York City. And then finally, we also have Youngwon Song, who is a lead budget and policy analyst on IBO's education team. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Mike, who's going to give a little background on Chalkbeat, and then hand it over to Emma to get us started. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Julia. My name is Mike Elson-Rooney. I'm one of the reporters at Chalkbeat New York covering New York City schools, and we're a nonprofit media organization. We focus exclusively on education in different kind of local districts around the country, and I've had the joy of being in New York City for 3 years at Chalkbeat and then was previously at the Daily News. I was really excited to get to do this event last year. I thought it was a really helpful event, and so I'm glad to be back. The IBO is a great resource for us as journalists, and it's really great to see them kind of pushing their great work out to the public, and so we're happy to support that. Um, and just to give you a little sense of what we do, a lot of our job is trying to make sense of this vast amounts of data that come out of the system in the moment and kind of contextualize it with our reporting. And just to plug one quick example, yesterday we saw a lot of data from the city on class size implementation, the new state class size law. And one of the things we noticed was that there are a lot of classrooms, as we're looking at the school level data, were listed as exempt. So we kind of dug into that and found that many schools didn't even know that their classes were being listed as exempt. And so we have a story up on our site now. There's a lookup tool if you want to look at your school. That's the kind of stuff we try to do. But I'm really happy to be here. As Julia said, this is a really pivotal time to have this discussion. We have a new mayoral administration coming in. We have incredible amounts of uncertainty from the federal level, and so it's really important to understand where the system stands and what the picture looks like. So I'll turn it back over to Emma.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, welcome everyone again. Just once again, my name's Emma Gossett. I'm a lead budget and policy analyst on the education team at IBO. I'm super excited to be here with you guys tonight. I'm going to walk through one of our publications, and it's called Education Indicators. This is an annual publication. It is part of IBO's charter to produce education reports. And so this is part of that. So annually, we update numbers on all of these various things. So we have enrollment data, we have demographic data, who is in our schools, how many students are in our schools. We have attendance and chronic absenteeism. So how often are students coming to school? And then we have student achievement for both grades 3 through 8, and then also high school. So what is the achievement rate for those different grade breakouts? And then we have some data as well on teachers and principals, and school buildings. And then this year we introduced a spotlight on a particular student population, and we specifically chose students in temporary housing, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But now I'm just going to walk through a few of the education indicators charts. It's really a treasure trove of charts, I would say. And so I would highly encourage everyone to go and look through it themselves. You'll be very surprised by what you find. There's just like quite a lot of charts you might not have thought to think of when thinking about student data. So right here, this is what we start off education indicators with. It's just a snapshot of who is in our New York City public schools. So in 2024 to 2025, that school year, so the most recently finished school year, there were 906,000 students in our public schools in grades 3K through 12. There were about 148,000 charter school students, and about 228,000 private school students. And you can see on the right-hand chart, that is a trend of enrollment. So that is looking at year over year enrollment. The yellow bar up top is both traditional public and charter schools lumped together. And then the purple line right below is traditional public, and the line at the bottom is charter school students. So the first thing you'll notice is there is a decreasing trend. And that's something that we have seen nationally and is also reflected in New York City. And that was certainly accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but we do still see those enrollment losses. And that is true primarily for the traditional public school students. We don't see a similar trend for charter school students. And in New York City specifically, we see a slightly increasing trend in charter schools. It's not the same rate as the decrease in traditional public schools, so they're not related necessarily one-to-one, but they're two different trends, and so it's certainly interesting to look through. Other charts in education indicators talk about specific enrollment trends. You can go back, Hannah. So this is enrollment at the borough level. So this is, again, that traditional public school. This is a year over year change. So from the 2023 to 2024 to the 2024 to 2025 school years, what was the change in enrollment by borough? On the left-hand side, you see the traditional public school students. And interestingly, for every borough, there was a varying rate of slightly decreased enrollment. But we don't see the same trends for charter schools. And we don't even see consistent trends within charter schools, which I think is super interesting. So in the Bronx, for example, you see a 9.5% increase in enrollment. But in Manhattan, for example, you see a 7% decrease. So there isn't really a consistent trend even within charter schools. So that's just a little on enrollment. Another big chunk of education indicators is about attendance. So in terms of attendance, In indicators, we break it out for different grade levels. So on the two charts that you're seeing right now are grades kindergarten through 5, but we also have grades 6 through 8 and 9 through 12 separately. And they list out the attendance rates by demographic breakout. So there is that average attendance for the grade level. So for example, on the left, you'll see the average attendance rate for kids in grades K through 5 in the 23-24 school year was 91.4%. So that was for that grade breakout, but it's different when you look demographically. So for example, the first 3 bars are gender breakouts. And so the top line is male, second line is female, and the third line is a new category that the DOE introduced just a couple years ago that identifies a student as neither male nor female, and that's a self-selecting category. And so you do see different trends or different rates of different attendance rates even within demographic breakouts. On the right-hand side, you see the chronic absenteeism rates. And chronic absenteeism means that um, a student is absent for more time. And so as you can see on the right, that also is very different by demographic breakout. And the one thing that I really want to note in this chart, which will come back later again, is the last 2 bars that you see. So for chronic absenteeism on the bottom, this is housing status of students. So that top bar is students in permanent housing, their chronic absenteeism rate, and then students in temporary housing. So you can see it's almost twice as much. And so that's certainly notable that students in temporary housing have twice the chronic absenteeism rate as their peers in permanent housing. You can go to the next page. Another key set of charts are on achievement. And so these charts are looking at attendance and achievement, the relationship between those two things, because we do know, as the charts tell us, that students with good achievement have higher proficiency rates on their examinations, on their state exams, in both grades 3 through 8 and in high school, than their peers who are either chronically absent and even more so their peers who are severely chronically absent. So we see this trend in all 4 of these scenarios, looking at both ELA exams and math exams. Okay, and now this is the students in temporary housing spotlight. This is a growing population of students in New York City, and or an existing population as well. And so because of the chronic absenteeism rates that we see, because of the achievement rates that we see, we really wanted to spotlight these students because they are students with higher support needs. And schools really do serve as a huge part of that. And so we know that there was a fair student funding, which is the main allocation for student funding or school funding in New York City. There's a weight added for students who are in temporary housing as a acknowledgement of the higher support needs those students may have. Yeah, so you can look at all of these on the IBO website. And that's education indicators.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Emma, for walking us through that, and glad for the chance to kind of dig a little more into some of that data. And I wanted to start with enrollment. It's a topic I find really fascinating, and I think it's also one that's really important to understand what we do and don't know about what's driving this, because I think it's one of those areas where people often like to kind of project their own preferred reason for what's driving that and thus their preferred policy solution. But just to walk through a little bit of what we've found reporting on this over the years. Number one, as you said, this is national. We're seeing it all across the country. Number two, birth rates have been declining in New York City for years. So a lot of this predates the pandemic. But it certainly accelerated in the pandemic. And, some of the most interesting data for me is looking at the rate of families with young children who have been fleeing the city. And, certainly that shows up a lot in the kind of childcare space. And that's obviously was a major issue in this most recent mayoral campaign. And so one way of kind of addressing that enrollment decline is by making the city more affordable, and you start with childcare. But as my colleague Amy reported, we've also seen some of those losses from when you go from pre-K to kindergarten. So it's complicated. And just one other quick note to make is that, my colleague Alex Zimmerman did some really interesting reporting on the fact that, charter schools, if you look at that line, they've been kind of steadily going up, but they were not immune to these forces. A lot of charter networks also saw big enrollment losses and were struggling with that. And some of the enrollment increases that we see are, in fact, adding new grades to schools rather than kind of more students coming in the existing grades. So I guess I just wanted to lay out a little bit of what we've seen, how complex this is. There's the question of, is it more students leaving the system or is it fewer students coming into the system, which IBO has done some really good work on. So, I don't know, Emma, if you wanted to add anything on that, but just kind of the complexity of what drives these enrollment changes.
Absolutely. I think you're completely right. The complexity around enrollment is there's a lot of it. I think also with charter schools as well, adding new grades, zombie charters potentially opening. I think those things also drive the potential like adverse from the losses that they may have seen as well. Um, yeah, but I think all of those are fantastic points. I think, yeah, enrollment nationally is declining. And certainly I know childcare is certainly a space that expansion has been happening in to try to entice families to stay.
And you see different administrations kind of attacking this from their vantage point. And, we've seen some in the current administration that there's been a lot of focus on opening new kind of rigorous programs as one way to try to keep families in the system. And I think we'll see how that pans out. Um, so to kind of bring this to the school level a little bit, I thought it was worth laying out. This may seem obvious, but why does enrollment matter to schools? We know it's tied to the budget, but it's a little complex how that actually trickles down. So can we maybe spell out a little bit, like, how does the funding to the city change because of enrollment? How does that then trickle down to schools? How does that actually look?
Okay, can I answer? Okay. All right. Nice to meet you. I'm Youngwan Song, the lead budget and policy analyst. And also because the before joining IBO, my research agenda is about fair student funding in New York City. So I can answer about your questions. In general, New York City's the school budget, regarding the school budget, the largest portion of school level budget is determined by the fair student funding formula. And that formula is based on the number of students and also by educational need. So that formulas really track the number of the students in each school. So it's really the enrollment trend is really important and critical for each school to expect their budget. And also these days, during the pandemic, and also Emma shows the trend enrollment is decreased. That means initially a school receives this amount of money, but actually the enrollment also decreased. That means that formula indicate reduction in their school budget. So that means something budget cliff. But during the pandemic, the city government used the federal stimulus fund to hold harmless about that kind of the enrollment reduction and also enrollment driven the budget reduction. Yes. So, and also in addition to the city fund allocation method, the fair student funding allocation, regarding the state foundation aid, that is the almost second largest, the largest portion from the state government for the New York City school budget. That also based upon the number of students. So that means every year over year, the amount of the state foundation aid is also relies on the number of students in New York City. So for the state government aid grant also really matter the enrollment matter for the state revenue. And also some, not 100%, many, the federal level, the grant, also they have their own allocation method or using formula. That formula and allocation methods also based upon the number of students. So city level, state level, federal level, all revenue sources really depends on the enrollment. So yes, so enrollment matter, and especially these days, along with that the decreasing trend, that means each schools they're facing the reduction their budget because of that the enrollment the decrease. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Youngwon. And we're getting some questions about budget, some of which I think we can save maybe for the second portion, which is more budget focused. But I did want to raise this one. Someone wrote, with respect to declining enrollment, it's notable that the hold harmless policy, where fair student funding is not adjusted for actual enrollment, has resulted in tremendous funding inequity across schools. I haven't seen any reporting about that. Well, stay tuned. That's something we're looking into. But I do want to kind of underscore that point that this has been a big policy change. It hasn't been done necessarily in a predictable way that schools can count on every year. There's always some suspense with it, but there are two major points in the year when budgets are adjusted. Once in the spring, when schools get their projected enrollment for the next year, and second in the fall when their actual enrollment is measured, and then they get either more or usually less, depending on how that compares. But in recent years, the city has been holding schools harmless, and so that does kind of take away school level funding from being that closely tethered to like actual enrollment. And so I think it is interesting to see how that has panned out, what that looks like in terms of how funding is being distributed across schools. And that's certainly something we're interested in looking into. I want to talk also about the role of immigrant students in enrollment and the enrollment picture in the past couple of years. And with the caveat that New York City does not ask for immigration status, there's no perfect way to measure that. But it certainly played a big role. I've seen estimates from the city of some 50,000 students since summer 2022. As Youngwon has laid out, student numbers are tied directly to funding, and that is part of why our former chancellor called that a godsend, despite all the challenges that came with it also. So could you talk a little bit about what we've seen over the past couple of years and how we would kind of think of the role of the influx of immigrant students in the enrollment picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the DOE does not collect immigration status, and so we don't have information on that on students, and so we don't track migrant students essentially. But when we look at the overall enrollment trend, we do notice some interesting things because, for example, this past year, so in 2024 to 2025, there were about 184,000 students who were English language learners. And the year prior to that, 23-24, there were more students. There were about 189,000. And so that decrease is interesting because this is the first, this year we saw a decrease once more in enrollment, whereas the year prior, we had seen a slight increase in enrollment. And so they're not one-to-one. They're certainly not causative, but it is notable the certain share of students who are English language learners within the New York City public school system.
And I'll just say we recently got the preliminary enrollment data from this year and saw the biggest year-over-year drop that we've seen since COVID. One of the things that I'm currently looking into is how much of that is related to changing immigration patterns, both the kind of total slowdown of new immigrants arriving and the possibility of students who are here leaving the city. So I think that's a really important part of this picture. Okay. And just for the last little bit of this, to talk specifically about some of the reporting we've done over the years on students in temporary housing. This has been a story that repeats and grows worse every year. We see the number continue to rise, and Advocates for Children does a data release on this every fall, and the most recent we had over 140,000 students. And I think you can see in some ways in the kind of composition of those students, the impact of that influx of migrant students to 44%, I think, in the most recent data I saw of students in temporary housing are English learners. One really just kind of interesting trend that Advocates for Children pointed out also was that for years, students in temporary housing were more likely to have special education classification than students not in temporary housing. But that's actually reversed over the past couple of years. And part of that may be because immigrant students are not being classified at the same rate. So a lot to look into there. I think, there are a lot of long-standing issues that that kind of drive those attendance numbers that we've seen, transportation, and I think that's only been exacerbated by some of the policies specific to, our newcomer students and the kind of 60-day rule and shelters closing and the disruption that results from that, and just kind of exacerbating the attendance issues there.
Absolutely. And another context for people is that a student, once they arrive, if they're placed at a school, they are entitled to continue their education at that school, regardless of if they move to a different shelter. And so for students who move to a very far away shelter, that may be very difficult to access that school. And so that's just an example of challenges.
Great. So I think we can move on to the presentation on school spending.
Right? Can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, now I'd like to highlight another IBO kind of on your update work that tracks the Department of Education spending back to the 1990s. So to start this slide, here's a broad look at the total agency spending or full agency cost. And also from now on, note that all dollars in our analysis were the inflation adjusted to 2024 dollars. And IBO in this analysis breaks the DOE spending into four major categories. Number one is blue section, the operational spending on the educational program and services. And the red area is the debt service, which covers the interest payments on the capital projects such as renovating, repairing, or building new school. And yellow part is the pension contribution. And the other part is other healthcare costs for retiree, but it is really tiny relatively, so we cannot recognize that part. So major part is operation, debt service, and pension. So when we look at these trends over time, those operational costs and pension contributions kept increasing. And also we can see that debt service also has grown steadily. And for your information, IBO also recently released a report on the school building, showing that the many New York City school facilities are more than 100 years old, so requiring significant and costly maintenance, so which is a major factor behind the rising in debt service cost. And for example, in this chart, I want to highlight it by 2024, the total DOE, the full agency cost, or DOE total spending, reached about the $40 billion. That is 2024. Next, let's turn to the per pupil spending. So this chart shows the enrollment trend in purple line and also the per pupil spending as the full agency cost. So DOE enrollment, as already the EMA already shows the recent trend. So DOE enrollment declined sharply after the 2020 the COVID pandemic. And although there has been a slight rebound, but the student count remained lower than the pre-pandemic levels. And also I want to highlight is there is something data is different from the MIUs. So I use the number from the mayor's the message. So that means it includes almost all students in the New York City. And at the same time, the per pupil spending has continued to rise. And for example, in 2024, the per pupil spending was roughly $36,000 per student. And also this amount is relatively really top level across the nation. And in addition to these spending trends, another important question is how have the revenue sources supported those DOE spending over time? So this chart presents the three primary revenue sources, each one from the different level of government. The blue area is a city funding, and the green area is a state funding, and purple area is federal funding. Actually, there is another the revenue source named other that is almost a private grant, but that is really tiny, about 1% of the total DOE spending and total DOE revenue. So following the increasing trend in the spending, we already saw, so all three revenue sources have grown over time. But here is one trend stand out clearly. That is relatively the city funding has grown the most, both in total dollar and also in its share of the DOE total budget and spending. So in 2024, the funding breakdown was approximately city is 52%, and state revenue accounts for 35%, and federal is 12%. But note that the 12% in this 2024 for the federal government is reflect the stimulus fund as well. And also I want to highlight the federal government, federal revenues role during the external economic shocks. So during the 2008 recession and also the COVID-19 pandemic period, the federal funding is substantially increased, helping offset the decline or slower growth in the city and state contribution. So these stimulus funds played a critical role during those difficult times. Finally, IBO also analyzed the DOE spending by units of appropriation. So it's not many people is not familiar with what the unit of appropriation, we call it UA. So a unit of appropriation is the spending category in the official budget documents that the city council oversight, review, and also approve. During the budget process, they use the big bucket for the DOE budget. And also DOE, Department of Education, divided these units by specific program area. So in 2024, there were 31 units of appropriations. For this chart today, we focus on the UAs, the unit of appropriation, most relevant to the school-based programs. So providing a more detailed view of what's driving the DOE total spending. And this chart shows the clear trend. So first, the program spending kept increasing, especially in special education program in the green area, and charter school in light, the purple area, and also pre-K and early childhood programs in the red and black area, respectively. So we can see that from the DOE perspective, and also they committed to these types of the educational program as the factor for increasing in DOE spending. On the other hand, meanwhile, the general education spending in the blue line, the blue bars, has declined in recent years, mainly reflecting the enrollment declines because the general education It also depends on the number of students. We have already observed the recent trends in the enrollment. So I think this reduction in the general education program spending reflect that trend in the enrollment. So these are all the slides that I prepared for today. So before finishing my presentation, I want to remind you to use our IBO website to view all other charts beyond today's topic. And also you can download the original data set that I made for this chart. So you can use that already the cleaned data set for your own research. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Youngwon, for that. And we have some really good questions that have been coming in the chat. And I want to start with one that is kind of relevant to some breaking news today. If you haven't heard that the federal administration has moved some of the core functions of the federal DOE to the Department of Labor, including its whole K-12 school oversight. So, we had a question about what does the elimination of the federal DOE mean for New York City schools? And I think maybe more broadly, like, what is the level of risk that New York City schools are facing as we see this federal administration use federal funding as kind of a tool to advance its policy aims?
Yes, that's a really time sensitive and also really policy relevant question. And also I'm also having the same question to see what impact of that federal level change and also federal level uncertainty impact on the New York City level. So I'm also having that question, but I try to provide some the top level or just big pictures of the impact. But as I already present the trend, and also the share of the federal government revenue, so I can say, except the COVID-19 pandemic period, then historically, on average, about 5% is the revenue portion that federal government support for the New York City. So some people can say that, oh, 5% is not that big. So relatively speaking, to compare to other state or other big cities, yes, this is smaller. But when we look at the program level or the grant level, for example, the Title I for the disadvantaged population, or Title IV or other titles for English language learner or temporary housing. So when we look at that program or some specific population level, then still, even though that overall portion is small, but the program level, the role of the federal grant is really substantial. So yes, we have to track those potential impacts of that federal level change. And also another example is recently, if you guys have listened about the news about this magnet school assistant grant, so those programs to support for the magnet schools in New York City, the total amount is not that substantial, but that because of that federal grant, new magnet schools can be established. But these days, the change in the support for that magnet school is kind of really ongoing lawsuit as well. So yes, so I can say overall totals, even though the overall total amount from the federal government is relatively small, but at the program level and at the very specific population levels, yeah, federal changes really matter to them. But IBO, so now these days, we also keep looking at and let's keep considering what's the exact or what's the potential impact happening in the future, but not yet, because still DOE also, they kept answering about, they also tracking the tangible impact from the federal government.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we have two questions here, which I'm going to try to thread together. I think about this idea of funding equity, which I think broadly defined as, how well does your funding system drive more resources to the most needy students? we have one question about, there was a recent change to the state's foundation aid formula, which is what the state uses to distribute money to districts. And New York City was pushing for some aspects of that, some of which didn't happen, and I think cost the city some money. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And then also, there's a good question in here about what do we know about how equitable New York City's funding system is compared to other districts? We know that, they spend this high amount per pupil, but do we know anything about how they kind of stack up in terms of how well they're making sure that money gets to the neediest students?
Okay. So let me try to answer the second question first, because
Okay.
that is more my area. Number one, so as I already mentioned, the New York City used the fair student funding formula to allocate their city tax levy fund to the each schools. And also the formula is originally, they take into account the education needs, the different education needs. So when you look at the formula, there are over 40 weights for individual level of education needs. That means the New York City's school allocation formula is really a resource allocation method for the equity allocation. So, and also from the comparative perspective, where it is hard to compare this New York City with other school districts in other cities because our New York City is really huge. But in the traditional school district, still many school districts do not use this kind of so-called weighted funding formula. So that means still they traditionally use the other method that is really depending on the desired level of pupil to teacher ratio and also district-wide average teacher salary, something like that. But that's their method, the traditional method, doesn't systemically care of those student educational needs. So that is not that equitable, not that the equitable allocation method. So we could say New York City has implemented that kind of equitable resource allocation method. But I cannot say this is really 100% perfect. But still, we are moving toward more equitable, keep moving forward that. But yes, we have that system. And also compared to the traditional public school district, yes, our method is more equitable allocation method. I can say that. And
Yeah.
for those,
Can I just jump in, Jungwon, really quickly? I think what Jungwon is saying, and I want to echo too, is the per pupil dollar may look like a lot, but you have to think about the student needs, as Jungwon has illustrated in New York City, and also what we are doing with those per pupil dollars. Those are supporting special education services for students. Those are supporting food assistance for students. Those are supporting mental health services. So I think thinking about the per pupil dollar in context of the students who are in New York City, we have a very high poverty rate in New York City. We're supporting those student needs and also the extent of services. So yes, there is instruction, and that's part of the per pupil cost, but there's a lot of other things that New York City schools are doing to support our student population. So I think it's important to keep the student population and the kinds of services that we provide through our schools in mind when you think of that per pupil number.
And also about the first question, that is about the reforming the foundation aid in the state level, right? So yes, IBO also published about the impact of the foundation aid change on the New York City, the spending. So I think the state level, the foundation aid, also they implemented the foundation aid formula as well to take into account the disparity in the revenue capacity across the school district. I think over 600 in New York State. So New York City is one of them. So from the New York City perspectives, okay, so this year, even though we have the additional foundation aid from the state government, but the amount is less than, the increased amount is less than expected because of this change current. So that means the formula is really based based on the statewide allocation formula. So from the New York City perspective, we decreased that amount. But in other words, some school district in New York State, they could receive more funding. So yeah, at the state level, they consider the disparities in revenue sources and also equitable funding formula for all school districts. But yes, from our own New York City perspective, now we have the less funding than we expected. Yes, so that is the ongoing debate. And also one thing that I want to say from our perspective, as we already talked about, one specific population for New York City is temporary housing. But for the other school district, maybe they're not that sensitive to the temporary housing student, right? So that means temporary housing is really more our New York City interest, but at the state level, maybe the temporary housing weighs something that is not yet that substantial change for that. So this is kind of combination of all kind of factors across all school districts at the state level, government, the resource allocation. So it's hard to say foundation aid formula is really for New York City, right?
We have a question here about when you look at per pupil cost, but kind of strip out some of the items like debt service or pension, how much are we actually paying for that goes directly into classrooms? And I guess this kind of dovetails with another question I wanted to raise, which is, I think we hear from a lot of incoming mayoral administrations, including this one, that they want to trim the fat in the contracting. The DOE spends $10 billion a year on contracts. And I think some of that, when you start to look more closely at what those contracts are covering, it gets a little complicated. Those are often funding pretty critical services. So I guess, could we talk a little bit about what is the kind of landscape of how much of that per pupil funding goes directly into classrooms, and then, where does the other stuff go?
I can start us off and then I'll maybe pass to Emma to talk a little bit about what she's seen in early childhood contracting. But I'll say too that it's the question of what goes directly into classrooms is a little hard to answer for us as budget team folks, because we can tell you how much, and Youngwon showed how much is in the unit of appropriation for general instruction. But I wouldn't say that that's the only amount of money that's going into schools and affecting classes. It's sort of the beauty and the burden of being a budget team, that we're the ones who can say we have access to information, but it's often limited. So I would give that as sort of a caveat when you're looking through our budget data. We hope it's really useful, but even something that shows you here's the budget category for general instruction, there are other places in the DOE budget that are going to go into supporting schools and students directly. They're just not always identified as exactly that. So sort of to frame this as a limitation when we look at budget documents, that is why we exist as a budget team. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to plug. If there is something of interest, you should reach out and ask us. We can do our best to help you understand how much funding is there for a specific program or a specific focus. But sometimes the budget documents make it a little hard to see. So I would almost caution against saying there's one particular place you can look to see what's going into, literally into all the supports that go into a school building, because it can really end up in different areas of the budget. But I think your question about contracting is something we're also tracking and looking particularly, maybe not at it as a place of waste or a place of overspending, but also some of the issues of implementation and process that we've heard. And I'm going to kick it over maybe to Emma to share a little bit of what we hear from providers on the ground too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you mentioned contracts, I think contracts, obviously, we know the DOE spends a lot on contracts, but contracts is a very broad category. And one of the many categories of contracts is early childhood providers. So the DOE contracts out a huge chunk of their early childhood programs to community-based organizations. So that shows up in the budget as a contract, but that is early childhood education being provided to services or to children directly by the service providers. We do know there have been some challenges around contracts. We know early childhood providers had issues with timely payments, and I know Mike, your team at Chalkbeat did some reporting on timely payment issues back. I think that was a couple years ago now, but that was when it was really, I think, most prescient for many service providers. But there are lots of other places where contracting comes in, transportation, for example. Um, yeah, I mean, Mike, you also, I know, I'm sure, know more about contracts. So if there's anything you guys are reporting on.
Well, transportation contracts are having a bit of a moment right now. Tomorrow night, actually, it's tomorrow night, I think, right? Yeah. The PEP is meeting to vote on a potential 3-year contract extension for the bus companies, and this comes amid a lot of debate. We spend almost $2 billion a year contracting out bus services to an extent that I think is pretty unusual nationwide. Like we really don't do any of that in-house, and that has raised a lot of issues about like, do these contracts have appropriate mechanisms for holding these companies accountable for service issues? And I think, a lot of the DOE and a lot of people on the panel for educational policy have expressed concerns about that and see this opportunity of renegotiating and extending the contracts as an opportunity to kind of rethink that and maybe try to move for a shorter term contract and try to, there's some things have to happen in the state for this to go forward, but try to rebid those contracts in a more more equitable way. So there's a lot going on that front. But I guess the broad point here was that a lot of these contracts are going towards critical infrastructure that we can't do without. And so, even though there's a lot of problems or potential areas for cutting in those contracts, how do you balance that with not sacrificing core services in the school system? And that is a challenge. Let me see. Yes. There's an interesting question here. I'm not sure I have a good answer on this, but someone wrote, I understand schools are encouraged to use a portion of their budgets with an MWBE, Minority Women-Owned Business Enterprises, I believe is the acronym. But that has been a major push in this administration to allocate a certain percentage of spending towards businesses owned by underrepresented groups. And, I think there's certainly a lot of, the numbers on that have historically been quite low. And so there's a lot of room for improvement on that end. But I think I've also heard some concerns about how that process has played out. I'm not sure I have an answer about how that will look in the coming administration. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts about that.
No, I don't think we've not looked at that specifically in schools either, but it's an interesting area to think about.
Mm-hmm. And then, there's a question here about the FSF formula not accounting for inflation or increased salary for principals and teachers. So this is, I think an interesting trade-off to kind of explore with the fair student funding model. You're not funding per teachers, and that I think can help drive equity in a lot of ways. If you're funding by teacher, if you have a school, maybe a more affluent school where you have more experienced teachers who are commanding higher salaries, then you're sending lots more money to that school. But it can also have other kinds of consequences. You all could maybe talk about this more intelligently than me, but like I have heard this issue come up at points about like what is the advantage of having a model that funds per student versus like per teacher? And is that something that's at all being like discussed in the DOE?
Yes, that's a great question, and really, yes, I can. I don't believe I can answer tonight, but it's really, yep. But that's this, yes. The As I said, the fair student funding is one type of the weighted student funding formula across the nation, and also that is really the formula's goal is money follows students' need, not money doesn't follow teacher, right? So our system intend to allocate money to the students based upon their specific education need, right? And then we have to think different angle for the teacher part because this is a funding formula, but the teacher, individual teacher, they decide where they work, right? So that means there is another part that we have to think about the sorting of the teachers based upon what, right? It's not driven by formula, but is driven by something other external factor. So the teachers, some teachers want to teach here or Manhattan or Brooklyn or specific area, right? So that makes some disparities in the teachers distribution or teacher allocation across the city. But as I said, the fundamental is our funding formula doesn't care about that sorting of teachers. We but focus on the student's need. But as the result of all types of allocation, different from this formula, but teachers movement or teachers working, the distribution of teachers is kind of different story from this formula. So maybe we have to consider that the result of teachers, as you said, the disparity in the teacher qualification or experience across school, but our formula right now, it doesn't care about in terms of the formula, we only focus on the student's educational need. So it's hard to say it's related to the formula, but it's related to other factors, how to allocate teachers. Then I can say another important area is the teacher salary schedule. So if you're familiar with that, the New York City's teachers, according to the union's contract, so teacher salary is set by the two major factors, the year of experience, teaching experience, and also education level, right? So given that the fixed teacher salary schedule, then our system doesn't make some incentive for some teachers to work some specific or higher needs community, something like that. So that is really totally different policy area. So it's hard to link our funding formula and teacher salary or teacher allocation. But I could say we have to consider other area to think about it. Yeah.
We're
And
getting a lot of great. Oh, I'm
I just
sorry.
want to jump in and really applaud Youngwon, who I put this in the chat too. He had a report that looked at the impact of fair student funding on that teacher distribution. I think Youngwon, what you didn't say, which I'm going to brag for you, that you found that was so interesting, is we saw that even after fair student funding was fully implemented, we saw that middle schools in particular had lower shares of teachers who were more experienced, teachers who had been there, who had different years of experience. And I think and it raises an interesting question for us in this time, as we're also thinking about hiring many more teachers to meet the class size compliance thresholds. How do you also think about teachers and incentives to draw teachers to higher need schools, to harder to teach in schools? For whatever reason, middle schools are sometimes harder to staff than elementary and high school. So I think Youngwon's research in particular really pointed at you can have full fair student funding, but still see some disparities across the city system. And I think that kind of thinking is what we'll especially need to think about going forward as we see more funding added for class size.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the last question I wanted to make sure I asked, which is, I think one of the big questions with this incoming mayoral administration is that a lot of the plans are quite expensive. And I think it's important to understand what does the budget picture look like coming in. And so I wanted to see if you could talk about what are some of the kind of big upcoming expenses that we are anticipating, whether that's class size law or other things, and how does that kind of maybe factor into this administration's fiscal outlook?
Okay, let me start first. Okay, but because I'm now working on this area, the class size reduction, but I think I can pick the one. If you ask one area, then I'm gonna say the class size reduction. And also yesterday, the DOE released their new report, the financial impact report and implementation report. So they still estimate $1.7 billion, 1 to 1.7 billion. That is expected estimate for the full compliance with the new class size. So that means the class size reduction law required the city fully comply until 2028 school year, right? So until then, they have to hire more teachers, and also they make more physical classroom capacity, increase the capacity. That means I think in the short term, the class size reduction, that is one big part of that the new regarding the spending size. And also, for example, for this current year, they allocated about $458 million only for that class size reduction purpose. So yes, I'm gonna pick that area is the one big area that we can expect for the city to need more extra funding. And yes, okay. Then maybe one more thing that I want to talk is about is hold harmless. We already talked about it, right? So historically during the pandemic, the spending for the hold harness about 200 million or 300 million. So that is not that small. But to make the schools harmless, so the city used the federal stimulus funding for that purpose. But right now, for this current year, DOE announced they commit to the hold harmless, but we don't know the next coming years, right? So that is kind of a question to the coming administration as well, because before the COVID-19 pandemic period, there is no consistent hold harmless policy. That means, yes, so that is kind of question for the coming administration about the hold harmless. But if they have goal for that purpose, that means they have to prepare for extra funding for that, the hold harmless provision.
Great. So I think the rest of the time we can use for Q&A. There's a couple questions here that I think we still haven't gotten to, but feel free to, if you have new ones, type them in the chat as well. Okay. We have a question about the lack of science education programs and where is the funding, how is STEM funded, and how is it allocated?
So I don't have an answer to that, but I am going to use this as an opportunity to plug something that, and I was remiss at the opening, I was going to do this. Behind the scenes of this event is Hannah Leverance, who is a community engagement specialist at IBO. She is truly magical. And she is the brains behind this outreach operation. She runs incredible school budget workshops where she can teach you how to look up something like that. So there's a lot of public documents, like something called a school allocation memorandum, which is really how the DOE shares budget information with principals, but also the public on specific funding for programs. And there's a ton of information if you're interested in looking at STEM. I'm going to guess there's one, I don't know, but I'd have to check. There's a ton of very specific documents, but they're very hard to read. So something that Hannah does, and if you're interested, please follow up with us, is provide school budget workshops where we will do a meeting. We do it in person, we do it virtually, whatever you prefer. And we walk you through how to look up these kinds of questions, both generally and then specifically for your school budget. So I'm just going to give this as an opportunity to pub that and say follow up with us if you're part of an SLT or a CEC or other community groups that would really like to look specifically at your budget or at the system. We can do that training and we would love to come to you. This Hannah Leverance, and I'm just going to put her email in the chat so that everybody emails her.
We had another question here about chronic absenteeism, and noted that it's a national issue. And any ideas on what's driving it? Is it societal attitudes? And I'll just say on this, I think obviously COVID is a huge factor here, and the kind of lingering impacts of that. I will say, I think I've heard a lot this idea that there was some kind of shift in people's understanding of the importance or necessity of like in-person school during COVID. And, I certainly I've heard some evidence for that. But when I've looked at the data in terms of like where you're seeing the biggest jumps in chronic absenteeism, my recollection was that it's actually among elementary students, which suggests like, they're not making their own decisions about attending school. There are factors that are happening in their homes, whether it's illness, whether it's maybe an increased kind of awareness about being cautious about illness, certainly immediately following the heights of the pandemic. And so I think it's really complex, but that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah, on chronic absenteeism as well, we do see that K through 5 students have a higher average chronic absenteeism rate than their grades 6 through 8 peers. But it is lower than the grades 9 through 12. So high school students do have the highest rate of chronic absenteeism. It's like 34.8% was the rate for 23, 20, or sorry, 22, 23, 23. But for grades K through 5, it is higher than their peers in grades 6 through 8, which is certainly notable.
And when you look at the growing number of students in temporary housing and those levels of chronic absenteeism, like that is making a dent in the citywide levels.
Yeah, I'll say too for students who are in grades K through 5 who are in temporary housing, their chronic absenteeism rate is 51.3%, whereas the average is 31%. So it's a 20 percentage point increase if you are a student in temporary housing than the average. So it is, yeah.
Yeah. And so I saw someone just asked about analysis of chronic absenteeism as it relates to Regents scores and graduation rates. And I think you guys showed some of that, right? But it's quite a clear
Yeah,
correlation.
yeah, definitely. In the achievement pages of indicators, we do have a few charts that show that for students who are chronically absent and students who are severely chronically absent, the achievement rates are significantly different, or very, very, very different, for students who have good attendance. It is much, much lower.
I also just want to make a kind of wonky data point, but I figure this is a good time to make that kind of point. This is not to minimize the importance of chronic absenteeism, but it is one of those measures where it's like a binary, you're either chronically absent or you're not. And that creates some complications. Like I've heard from principals that they often feel this incentive to focus their efforts on the bubble kids, the kids who are like 89% attendance, because they're more likely to shift them over that line than the kid who's maybe, 60% attendance, even though you could argue maybe that kid needs more support. And it also creates a bit of a skew when you look at like these high figures for chronic absenteeism, but then you look at the actual overall attendance rate and it's dipped, but it's from like, 91 to like 88% or something. And so this is again not to minimize the importance of that, but just to put it in some context that as a data measure, that comes with some trade-offs.
Yeah, absolutely. To be even more specific on the data measure, just because I also love all the wonky stuff. For a student to be considered chronically absent, it means that so the chronic absenteeism rate, to be more specific, is a New York State Department of Ed measure, and it's the share of students who were enrolled in at least 10 school days, and then they were present for at least one day, but they were present less than or equal to 90% of the time. So that 90% is that like cutoff, and then severely chronically absent is an 80% cutoff. But you're right, it is like you're either over that or you're not. And I think 90% is a pretty like if you're thinking about all of the students who fall above and below that, it's an interesting number.
It's right around the overall attendance rate for the
Yeah,
city, so you're going to have a lot of people right on the either side of that.
definitely.
Um, okay. So this is one I've been reporting on and I find really interesting. So there's a question about one of the things Mamdani wants to do is universal pre-K, nursery, childcare. How much incrementally do we expect that will cost? And I'll plug a story I did recently that tries to kind of map out what it would take operationally and financially to build out universal childcare. The campaign puts the total cost at around $6 billion a year. But that also includes an effort to bring childcare teachers up to some kind of pay parity. And there's a huge disparity. I was like shocked even studying the stuff, but that the median income for a childcare teacher in New York City is $25,000 a year. For a K to 12 teacher, it's closer to 100,000. So that's quite a gap. Um, but one of the things I found reporting that story was that there are some estimates for what it would take to like kind of phase this in, and I think the most common kind of suggestion for how to do that would be aging down the current pre-K, 3K system to include 2-year-olds. And I saw one estimate from the comptroller that part alone would cost about $1.6 billion a year. So still quite a lot, but maybe a lot less than 6 billion. Um, and Emma, I know you do a lot of early childhood education stuff too. So if you have any other.
Yeah, totally. So I'll say a few things. 3K and pre-K right now, we spend about $2 billion on that. And I also saw the aging down for 2K. I think all of these like proposals are super interesting. I'm really interested to see what the administration decides to do. And I think I'm really I we have a few we have this thing at IBO called what ifs, and it's kind of like things that could possibly happen. And this seems to me like your article specifically is a great opportunity for like people to think like what if like what could happen. And I think I'll be really interested to see what actually happens. But some other things I know, I was just speaking to some providers recently, and they brought up the stark disparities in salaries. And I think that brings up again the contracting part of 3K and pre-K, and how reimbursement rates and like contracted rates kind of set standards for that. But DOE teachers we know have contracts with DOE and get paid salaries and all the various things that come with that. And so I think it's just an interesting difference. And I, again, will be very interested to see what the next administration does.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to our time. So I don't know if anyone else wants to wrap up, but thank you all so much, folks from the IBO, for all your knowledge and expertise and commitment to bring this out to in an accessible way, and then really great questions and comments from the audience. Y'all are super engaged and really appreciate it.
Agreed. And I've gotten some requests for follow-up. So we are going to do our best to follow up with recording and resources. And as much as we can, we're going to pull it all together and share with everyone. I do want to take the opportunity to plug IBO has a newsletter that you can sign up for. Chalkbeat has a newsletter that you can sign up for. So we will be sharing those in our follow-up as well, because the best way to sort of stay in touch with what we're putting out and what Chalkbeat's reporting on and the real on-the-ground reporting is to sign up for our newsletters. So we will be sharing those links as well in our follow-up so that you can stay in conversation with us. Great. Thank you everyone so much.
Thanks,
Everyone.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Bye bye.